And Jesus wept. For there were no more worlds to conquer. I did it!
Virtual reality is more popular now than probably ever, currently being relatively affordable to much of the general public from a variety of publishers and providers. And while we as humans are becoming more and more accustomed to the presence of VR technology in our everyday lives, would you believe me if I said that animal virtual reality farms might be right around the corner? Project Second Livestock has proposed the chicken coop of the future with chicken virtual reality headsets and a futuristic enclosure that would combine the efficiency of cage farming with the supposed humanitarian and health benefits of free-range farming. If you think I'm joking and that this project is a hoax, well, you're not the only one to do so, but hang on, it's actually legitimate, and there might be more than meets the eye from the suspiciously sounding headline. So I ask you today, friends, can we teach animals to use virtual reality technology, and if so, why would we do that? And what might it mean for the future of humanity and our own interactions with virtual reality technology? So let's start with that first question. Can animals use VR tech? Look, I laugh all the time at really dumb stuff on this channel, and particularly what dumb stuff people do in scientific experiments, or not-so-scientific experiments. But honestly, the stuff we do to humans is nowhere near astonishingly as hilarious as what we tend to do to animals. Whoa, wait, don't get me wrong there. I'm just saying it's really funny, not just to me, but apparently to everyone, given the reaction to Second Livestock and their cockulus rift, that we all kind of recognize how weird and funny it is to hook innocent animals up to technology. Because that's pretty much the hardest way one species can dab on another species. But the obvious question is there anything to this? Is this just a hoax? And does it have any merit? Well, I took a look at their proposal, and the chicken habitat that they lay out seems pretty bizarre, but it's actually based on real science, as it is quite close in its torture device appearance to research from Aronnock and Tank 2014, who built a similar virtual reality device for mice, using a rotating ball that allows for continual movement in a 360-degree rotation, with a round screen projector rather than a headset. It's a good model to follow, though, as the researchers found that rats placed in this virtual environment forwarded similar neural activity as rats did in the real world when they were given a series of reward-giving tasks, which provided water to the rat when it completed the task. To serve as a treat for movement in the apparatus, the animal was given a little drink of water when it correctly navigated through a maze projected on the screen. This means that rats were essentially incapable of discriminating, or at least as far as the researchers could tell, reality from virtual reality. We've also studied VR in animals a bit more closely related to us humans, as Dolan's et al. 2014 studied chimps and their capacity to navigate a virtual maze. They found that chimps, on average, were actually better at navigating complex mazes than human children were into their early teens. Yeah, chimps are better at Minecraft than children, imagine my shock on that one. Both the children and the chimps were trained to complete a maze task within this Microsoft Windows 95 screensaver-looking thing, so all the participants, ape and human, were familiar with the software and understood how the maze worked. While the starting position remained the same, the location of the end goal was random. In order to incentivize the chimps, the researchers provided treats to them in reward, which I'm going to suppose were chicken tendies given the nature of this discussion. You know, some good boy points. Two of these chimps, Pansy, very creative guys, and Mercury were particularly enamored with the virtual reality task, while other chimps were less interested in using
brown bricks with Minecraft.
Just out of curiosity and for comedic effect, I looked for studies on chimp autism and couldn't find anything within 5 minutes of very rigorous searching, but hey, this Minecraft proclivity that was found in Pansy, that might just be the very first example of it. Point is, chimps are as good at Minecraft as are young children, and some very special, exceptional individual chimps, such as Pansy, place among the relatively rare 20% of human participants of any age who used a faster and more efficient method of goal-seeking in comparison to the 80% of both humans and all other chimps besides our special boy, who were all wall-hugging casuals. Here is Pansy navigating a virtual maze. Observe his expression, cold and dead like all professional Minecraft players, communicating across species. If only you knew how bad things really are. And yet somehow, his visage is still more full of hope than that of the Robo-Bonobo, and I had no reason to show you that image other than because I wanted to haunt your dreams, as it currently does mine. Anyway, if you already think the typical player in online games is an ape, you might not be wrong for much longer. A study from Martin et al. 2014 studied the comparative abilities of chimps and humans to compete in a reward-based virtual game, wherein players earned a reward after selecting a shape on a touchpad, and then after winning or losing, were shown the choices of their opponent. By essentially working together and anticipating the choices of the other player, both players would earn the most rewards. In game theory,
but hey, That's just a theory.
This is the Nash equilibrium, named after the brilliant West Virginian autist, obviously not me, but instead Dr. John Nash, for which he won a Nobel Prize in economics. Let me give you an example of how Nash equilibrium works. If one company is producing colorful custom-made rubber phalluses for $100 a dildo, if the system is in equilibrium, almost all other dildo sellers will be offering dongs for around $100 a dick. But why wouldn't one of those sellers of sexual toys not offer their wares for a little cheaper, let's say $80, you ask? Well, because if one seller does, then all the other sellers will do their best to match the reduced cost. But as a result, this means that every seller in the system now makes less money, all receiving lowered rewards for these same efforts.
We don't get in each other's way, and we don't insult the other girls. That's the only way we win. That's the only way we all get laid.
What's really interesting is that Martin et al. Found in a virtual game testing this machine of matching maximal profits that chimps were actually more adept than humans, learning the game more quickly, and being closer to reaching a Nash equilibrium. The familiarity could have been due to the chimp subject's prior exposure to the tablet for previous experiments, and remember that this was conducted in like 2012 or 2013 based on when they collected the data, and that was back when touchscreens were a little bit less ubiquitous than they are now, where you cannot escape them. But what's really interesting is that chimps were significantly more likely to approach the equilibrium than were humans. That is, that games that provide rewards and rely upon predicting the behaviors of others in addition to repetition, well, chimps might just outperform Homo sapiens. Well, that sure would explain the fighting game community now, wouldn't it?
Terrible. Oh, look what I can do online. Wow.
I must note that despite all of the positive evidence I provided for the Oculus Rift, there are some reasons for concern in terms of the project's feasibility. While we have conducted some research using VR in chimps, bonobos, mice, and humans obviously, chickens are far more removed from us biologically than our primate cousins, and even other mammals. For example, birds and many other non-mammalian species perceive ultraviolet light differently than humans do, as reviewed in Bennett and Cuthill 2004, who indicated divergence from mammals in pigeons and various other bird species, including chickens, with mammals being generally less perceptive of ultraviolet or near ultraviolet light. In insects and other non-mammals, UV sensitivity has been proposed as practical for evolution, as for example, bees may more easily be able to locate flowers and differentiate between flower species using near UV light detection.
Maybe it's making you think of the surface of a sunflower. How does this make you feel now?
That's just one example, that unrelated since the point of this video is not an analysis of bird vision, but it still serves as a potential issue with the idea of just plopping a VR headset onto a chicken and expecting the animal to react similarly to humans or even other animals. That doesn't even begin to describe the problems in creating and developing an apparatus that could enclose the bird long-term, rather than the temporary apparatus Aronnax and Tank used in their study of rats. But speaking of Aronnax and Tank, this supposed confound of the eyesight thing might not be as bad as it seems, given that birds might have a little bit more in common with mice in terms of their vision than humans do. Apes and humans have stereoscopic vision. This means that our eyes are placed in the front of our heads, whereas both birds, such as chickens, and mice have laterally placed eyes. And as such, Ducet, Goulet, and Martinez Trujillo, 2016, examined these types of virtual technologies currently available across species and were able to develop a virtual reality toolbox that they proposed could be used and calibrated to function similarly in both stereoscopic, that is frontally eye-placed animals, and animals with laterally positioned eyes, meaning that some of the visual problems may already have tools that can be altered to best suit the eye of the cock.
Phrasing?
Taking this all together, we have some pretty significant evidence that both for humans and our mammalian friends, as well as more evolutionary distinct species such as rats and birds, we would all likely be similarly affected by exposure to virtual reality, being similarly incapable of telling the difference between reality and the imagery we're being shown. And so for this reason, both humans and our furry or feathered friends are kind of inept at determining fan fiction from reality on a basic level. But the next obvious question about this project is why? Seriously, why would you put a chicken in virtual reality? Well, because animal rights activists insist that animals need room to live and thrive to be the healthiest both for themselves and for the humans who consume them. Still others argue that the space needed to raise free-range livestock is itself environmentally untenable given the large amount of space it requires. Yet even others emphasize the importance of meat yield, needing more meat to feed the exploding world population. And even others because just screw you, I want to make the most money by selling my cocks.
Phrasing.
So let's take a moment to look at why a chicken VR chamber might actually be of value to people with various different beliefs. The reason why this proposal made people laugh is because it seems ridiculous. Why would someone build Livestock VR? Sure, I can see a personal purse puppy PlayStation VR system.
Hey yo, I'm a dog, give me your lunch money. Wolf mother, give me the meat.
But Livestock? Why would we want to build a stacked, multi-floor animal farm that keeps animals in a virtual world that, as we've seen, they probably can't differentiate well from reality? Well, because there is still a bit of a debate on how we should raise and keep animals. While free-range livestock care seems far more ethical, it inherently requires more space. So stacking the animals on top of each other would clearly be a reduced space usage. But additionally, free-range livestock also produces lower meat yield, which means problems not just in terms of space, but in terms of feeding the growing population. Wang et al. 2009 examined the weight, growth rates, and meat production of female chickens from the same broods, raised separately in either typical chicken pens or in free-range environments, and found that free-range chickens tended to grow more slowly and gain less body weight over the same period of time as their indoor sisters, but that much of this was made up by abdominal fat and thick boy thighs to hold up their chubby tendies. And I need be clear that the aforementioned was paid for and conducted by the Ministry of Agriculture of the People's Republic of China based on a particular breed of Gushi chickens.
What music are you into? I like this. It's very grown up.
Gucci gang. Oh.
Which grow apparently more slowly than Western cocks. I suppose you could say that's being cut from a different feather.
Phrasing!
It's only one study of many. Broiler chickens, which are fast-growing, high-yield chickens that we're most likely to come across in most of the West, were assessed by Polwich and Doctor, 2011, who found of their very Polish sample of poultry that chickens raised indoors tended to be generally heavier and healthier than their free-range counterparts, having a lower general mortality rate, but with no overall effect on the quality of meat across free-range and caged birds. While in contrast, a review from Blaskovich and what? I have no idea. Can you help me out here?
Bogosavljevic, Bošković.
Thanks. 2012 reported that research on various types of chickens generally concludes free range provides somewhat higher meat quality, but generally less meat. What we can glean from these bones is that free range birds probably produce less meat, that their need for more space is more environmentally consuming, but perhaps they produce a little bit better quality of meat. Can we assume this is because they led a freer, happier chicken life? Maybe. It's a bit hard to say because we can't really know if being free range creates higher meat quality solely because the birds are happier, or if it's just because they get more exercise. It's a little bit difficult to assess the quality of life involvement. But I should say that similar effects have been found in other animals. For example, Sather et al. 1997 found that free-range pigs possessed less fat and more muscle than their confined counterparts, regardless of the time of the year, meaning that even in the winter, when a little extra chunky all around, the free-range pigs were still healthier, if lower in weight, mirroring what we've seen in chickens. But the problem is figuring out what produces this. Is there a psychological element that makes freedom to roam around produce leaner, better meat, albeit in a diminished capacity? And given that all of the research on VR and its psychological side effects comes from humans, and it's not like we can put a baby in a pen, one in a field, and then one in a virtual baby life simulator, which I'm guessing is just a prolonged game of Who's Your Daddy.
Come on. I need to find new ways to die.
And then compare the quality of the baby meat, well, really, we're just guessing.
Oh, hi! Baby! The other weight meat!
But if you can reduce the amount of space needed to care for the animals, and maximize their quality of life by giving them free range of movement and putting them into a virtual chicken pleasure palace, doesn't that kind of seem like the best solution for everybody's gripes when it comes to raising poultry and other livestock? Based on what we've looked at, it doesn't seem unfeasible that you could take a chicken, place it into a virtual reality apparatus that allows for full movement, and given what we know about animal exposure to VR, it will likely be able to adapt and acclimate to this technology over a fairly short period of time. I would note that I had a couple of questions about this product when I first saw it, because they also have announced 2 new similar projects, one for household pets and one for zoo animals, and that set off some scam alarms in my head. But the more I looked at the existing data from this whole general field of study, the more realistic it seems. Of course, I'm also kind of reminded of the libertarian utopian projects of self-sufficient floating cities when I see proposals that seem very out there, at least at first glance, and particularly when it comes to funding such a huge project. But is it doable? Yeah, seems so. That might not make it financially profitable, even though it might be more environmentally friendly, moving a large farm into a small, multi-floored enclosure. We still haven't really addressed the big chicken in the room, which are the ethical considerations of this. A big issue a lot of people have with the raising, carrying, and eventual slaughter of animals for meat is the well-being of the animal both physically and psychologically. This is a really complex issue that varies highly animal to animal. For example, this force-feeding technique is used on geese to produce the fatty liver culinary delicacy foie gras. This process is illegal in much of Europe and in the state of California precisely because of how incredibly cruel it appears, when any ornithologist will tell you that ducks lack a gag reflex, meaning that this action causes no pain for the animal, at least not physically. But does it hurt it psychologically? Regardless of your opinion on the topic of foie gras, given we can't ask the duck how it feels when we consider potentially placing animals into a small enclosure the size of some of the worst examples of factory farming, how exactly does virtual chicken reality heaven stack up psychologically for the health of the animal long term? Again, we can't ask it. Do we have any good reason to believe that just because animals can't distinguish virtual reality from real life visually, that they can't distinguish it psychologically? Would the mouse matrix really be a good thing for animals? To understand the psychological effects, positive or negative, of VR on animals, we have to look at the only ones we've tested it on, humans, as a proxy to get a better idea of how other animals might respond. And also because it's pretty interesting how we tend to respond. Plenty of studies have looked at the many psychological effects of virtual reality on humans, and we're just starting to do this research. But I want to start with a series of studies that has a lot of implications for all of the other research. In the mid-2000s, a graduate student at Stanford, Nick Yee, had an idea concerning human interaction in virtual reality. That idea was that digital worlds are so indistinguishable visually from reality that humans would adapt to the body and environment that they inhabit in a digital world socially and psychologically. In his doctoral thesis, he tested this idea and proposed a Proteus effect of virtual embodiment. Specifically, what this study found was, empirically, that short people got no reason to live, online or offline. Several studies had previously shown that shorter people usually take the shorter end of the stick, pun absolutely intended, in a money-splitting game. Usually, 2 participants were asked how to divide $100 betwixt each other. Shorter people consistently took less money in the split than did tall people. This might be because tall people are seen as more physically attractive or physically intimidating, or as having some greater social status, or, just being more capable of beating your butt.
We're with him.
With this in mind, Yee and Balance in 2007 used a similar negotiation game within a digital environment and within a digital body. Regardless of physical height, participants were placed into an avatar in a VR headset and asked to redistribute the wealth with another participant, who was actually another researcher, a Confederate. Participants were randomly assigned to either a short, tall, or same-sized avatar as their partner, causing them to either meet at eye level or be forced to face up or down using the VR headset, producing a similar effect as the real world, virtually, despite the limited graphical capabilities of the time. And I mean, woo lads, look at some of these handsome bunch of avatar mugs. Does it make you feel better or worse if I were to tell you that these were scanned from students' actual faces? Let's just be nice and say they weren't. They found that in addition to sharing more and being more open with attractive taller avatars in the negotiation task, while at first there was little difference between those randomly assigned to any avatar height, by the third time they played this negotiation game, 72% of short avatar users accepted the unfair split, while far fewer of normal and tall avatars accepted a bad deal, ranging from 32 to 38%. That means that over a short period of time, and pun again absolutely intended, the effects of being short in the real world on negotiation and social interaction began to become present in all people regardless of their own physical height when put into a short digital body. This indicates that the longer we interact in virtual environments, the more we come to emulate the anticipated social roles of the digital body we're placed in. To place this into the example of livestock, if we were to give them a larger body in comparison to the imaginary birds in their environment, they may become psychologically affected differently, perhaps perceiving the self as being stronger, maybe even more alpha regardless of their physical forms. So theoretically, we could create a chicken utopia where every bird feels like an alpha chick amongst mere birdlets.
He's too little for me. I know.
But where the Proteus effect gets a little bit more bizarre is in a follow-up study from Yee, Balance, and Douchenot 2009, who found a unique scaffolding element to the shame of induced shortness. While similarly to the previous experiment, they found that those in shorter bodies tended to take worse deals regardless of actual physical height, astonishingly, there was a slight carryover effect of decreased negotiation skill outside of the VR environment. After this initial interaction, participants removed the VR headset and played the exact same negotiation game with a Confederate that they had been interacting with virtually. It turned out that this effect of decreased negotiation skill remained present for a few minutes after the exposure to the virtual reality body. People acting face to face were still emulating the acceptance of being swindled that they had when they were given a short avatar. This means that not only does the nature of our digital bodies potentially affect our interactions with others within VR, it may affect our self-confidence, our quality of communication, and our capacity for negotiation based on the use of a digital body in virtual reality. What's even more horrifying or fascinating, depending on your outlook, is that based on the extant data, this may potentially scaffold into offline communication dysfunction for a short period of time after using VR. And once again, intended.
Mindless. When will they ever learn?
Who and what you are in VR can affect who and what you are offline, unplugged. If these crazy effects of virtual embodiment seem kind of unbelievable coming from the mid to late 2000s when the data were gathered using comparatively limited VR technology, can you even imagine what it's like in terms of the technical vastness of the current year? Well, luckily you don't have to imagine, as we do have some updated evidence to describe the effects of visual realism on identification with avatars. As Jang Kim and Ryu, 2010, found that South Korean players who played MMOs and wanted to increase their MMO game to fight against the invasion of DPRK gold farmers might actually benefit from using an avatar that looks more like themselves.
Rosita? Oh, Rice Eater. Rice Eater.
That is, players with self-similar looking avatars reported greater mastery of the game than those whose avatars were dissimilar in appearance. While a cool finding and useful for those trying to secure a stellar contract at a top gaming clan, it doesn't really apply to animals. Despite what we've already learned about chimpcraft indicating that World of Chimpcraft might also be a possibility in the future, for chickens and livestock, I kind of doubt we'll be giving them third-person avatars. But we also have some data from first-person experiences as well, with updated graphics. Latashik, 2017, looked at responses to more simplistic representations of humans on their own avatars as seen in a digital mirror, and others ranging in degrees of humanness. In this case, they used a robot model, a wooden model, and a realistic avatar created from scanned 3D photogrammetry, and looked more realistic. Participants viewed a more abstract version of the human face as less creepy, but also less human, expressing more trust and attraction towards more realistic avatars. In contrast, participants felt as if their virtual bodies represented themselves the most when seen in a virtual mirror, when both their own digital body and that of other actors in the environment were similarly matched in realism. I think that it's not completely unreasonable to suppose that animals would prefer a little bit more HD graphics, and no offense to Second Livestock here, but 0 out of 10. You didn't even try. At least go download some Unity Store chicken assets from this century or something. I bet that exists. Oh yeah, actually tons of them exist. Look, this one's $10. Get that indie game low poly aesthetic out of here. Although I should note that research has found that when cats look at human faces, they might just see us as other big cats. So who knows, maybe chickens don't need 4K. But there's further implications of how VR might allow us to feel better or worse as versions of ourselves socially. It could have physical effects related to that as well, and given the scaffolding nature of Proteus effect, it could lead to long-term changes in physical behavior. Pena and Kim, 2014, had participants play a game of Wii Tennis and were given either a thick or a thin avatar and instructed to play a few matches against an opponent avatar which herself was either of a normal body weight or a very large lass. Participants with slender avatars of themselves were recorded as having their waists move more, all on their own. While again I doubt we would place livestock into a third-person avatar, this might still be important when it comes to perceptions of others within a digital space and in general. Looking further, those with normal-sized avatars expressed more waist and wrist activity when their opponent was also of average weight, while the supersized self-avatars were less active when the opposing avatar was of a smaller size, and were more active against fellow big booty bitches. What this means for us, taking the Proteus effect into consideration, means that if you're unhappy with your weight, a virtual game wherein you play against bigger people might actually incentivize you to move more, maybe shred a few more calories in the process. Moreover, this greater movement might actually transfer onto activity outside of a digital world, as well as possibly promoting overall more healthy, active lifestyles. Just as mostly a thought experiment,
Be gone!
For animals, if we place them into a virtual world with the type of self-perception through virtual mirrors, giving a chicken a buff bird body in a world of other active avians might encourage more movement within the apparatus.
Right! Didn't think you can lay around my house all day doing all. Go find a job, you sausage roll looking twat!
And yes, allow for a healthier animal, with encouraged towards motion. But admittedly, it's a stretch. Much like that avatar's pants.
Damn, boy!
Surely, based on what we've already discussed, there must be a ton of other research on this potential scaffolding effect, right? No, not really. A few years after publishing his work, Dr. Yi went on to work in the private sector, initially working for Ubisoft and then co-founding Quantic Foundry, which provides gamer behavior research based on motivation modeling to major game companies. Hey Blizzard, maybe you should hire these guys, just saying. I get a feeling that his abandonment of pure academia really soured interest towards this fascinating topic, as it has been scarcely mentioned in the literature or directly assessed more than a few times since around 2015, which is about when VR became very readily available. It might also just be because the evidence is a bit spurious, as the first study in the 2009 paper failed to even isolate the Proteus effect when players were using World of Warcraft avatars rather than more human ones, but that may have been because they were seen as too fantastic or hideous to be relatable. But I certainly hope there is more done to study this effect, which proved that short people get dunked on, even digitally. So if VR can change how we act with other people, can it change how we feel? Banos et al. 2006 had participants walk through a virtual park setting, wherein the lighting had been manipulated to appear either more pleasant or more depressing, and found that those who moved through the brighter and happier setting were themselves happier, less anxious, less sad, and more relaxed, while the opposite was found in the sad setting, with decreased happiness, increased sadness, and a small effect on anxiety and relaxation. Look at this park. This is so grayscale. Alexa, play You Got That 2-hour version. A previous study from Freeman 2004 specifically looked at how VR increases happiness and relaxation more than other forms of media, placing some participants in a virtual paradise with soothing narration while others merely closed their eyes and listened to some ASMR, and they found that those in the virtual reality paradise zone were much happier and more relaxed. Forget Netflix and chill, let's VR chat and chill.
Oh, yes, your feathers will be bountiful.
I'm eating. Why is there a short-necked penguin?
Because we're gonna feed him alcohol. Come on now.
But jokes aside, there are some really awesome outcomes for physical and mental well-being and healing when it comes to VR. Looking at a recent meta-analysis including 30 studies from over 1,000 participants with various anxiety-related disorders, including phobias, performance fears, and PTSD, Carl et al. 2018 illustrated that VR therapy for anxiety disorders was similarly as advantageous for treatment as in-person therapy is, in comparison to control groups that received no therapy. In terms of exposure therapy for phobias, which involves dunking someone face first into whatever their fear is, yeah, I can understand why virtual exposure might be as effective, if not more effective, than real-life exposure when your fear is, I don't know, let's say spiders.
Oh, look, the baby's come out of it.
Equally as astonishing is the capacity of VR to help in physical rehabilitation. As a meta-analysis from Scapian et al. 2018 of 34 trials assessing burn victims that placed them into a cool and comfortable VR environment found that generally it is a serious positive force for aiding in rehabilitation. When looking specifically at pain, various studies have found 20% reductions in overall reported pain of burn victims or 31% decreased pain during physiotherapy aided by VR. Some fMRI data from burn victims shows a decrease in activation in the regions of the brain that are associated with pain. And while this was not identified in every single report, VR may come to play a major role in both psychiatric and medical therapy in the future. And considering it's already being used to train surgeons, the applications of VR for medicine are ripe for discovery and innovation. Another meta-analysis from Malloy and Milling 2010 found similar results of VR exposure on the mitigation of pain in other types of disorders, as well as serving as even a distraction for small pain. That means that if you turn into a quivering blob of fear at the sight of a needle, by putting you into VR and distracting you with visual cues that are dissimilar from the typical doctor's office, you probably won't even feel being poked by the needle. So we can already see that in addition to aiding with serious mental and physical health issues, VR might also be used to ameliorate subclinical problems, such as problems with self-esteem. Falconer et al. 2014 had psychology students console a digital child that was crying from an egocentric perspective, that's first person, and then from the eyes of the girl that they had just consoled. They found that over time, participants were less self-critical and felt greater self-compassion, that's loving the self, after this encounter and reported feeling less anxious about interaction. A second study from Falconer et al. 2016 followed up with participants who engaged in this experiment, which, let's be real, is more than just a little bit creepy to look at, a grown person in a form-fitting bodysuit trying to comfort a virtual child.
Teach kids their ABCs in Jamaica? Sure. ABC where the sun shines. ABC where the palm trees grow. Welcome to the islands, man. I'm feeling Ira.
But I digress. They found that this same exposure, again, decreased self-criticism, increased compassion, decreased fear of caring for the self, and generally reported being less depressed, not just directly after the experiment, but 4 weeks later. Once again, this indicates a scaffolding effect of VR, which might have some more broad implications for mental health if we can inculcate feelings of self-worth through virtual reality. But with all of this in mind concerning the human mind, wouldn't we have some pretty good reasons to believe that if we took a chicken and placed it into an apparatus in a pleasant virtual environment, with false social interactions that might allow for development of socialization skills, pro-social behaviors, including being more active, inducing perpetual pleasure and positive mood states through beautiful environments, constantly being rewarded for moving around and exploring their environment freely without fear of pain in this virtual paradise, in this virtual world which can be used to treat both mental and physical dysfunction as well as reduce any pain the animal might feel otherwise, and on top of all of that, seemingly provide all of the benefits of free range with even greater efficiency than caged farming. I think we can say, yeah, there's some evidence for that. But should we?
Psychologically, this is fascinating. Doesn't it make everyone want to lock them in separate rooms and do experiments on them? Just me then.
Despite all of the evidence that this is probably a really good model for chickens, it would probably make them live pretty happy, chickeny lives. By this same logic, could we not ask a similar question of humankind? Would we all be better off, happier, healthier, and more pain-free if we lived in virtual reality? Based on what we know about humans and our response to VR, and comparing it to how it might similarly affect animals, I think we have a pretty good rationale as for why chicken VR might make sense. Not only how it's feasible, but also why it might lead to a better life for chickens, and other livestock as well. But in terms of the psychological benefits, it's hard to transfer all of the psych stuff we find in humans completely onto animals. We are very disparate after all. For example, the research of Dr. Yi is so uniquely related to human behavioral patterns and our interpersonal context that it would be a real stretch to totally relate them one-to-one onto the brain of a bird. But again, based on the data that I've looked at on several topics of concern, we look about putting chickens into the matrix. Let's just say cyber chickens might just be the future. Where I become concerned is knowing what we know about VR in animals, extending from social interaction and fears and anxieties to perceptions of physical pain. What does this march forward in technology mean for humankind overall? If tomorrow someone came and knocked on your door and said they could place you into a perfectly curated environment where all of your needs or wants would be provided for you and where you could live out every last one of your lascivious furry fan fictions, or if you're not an utter degenerate, live out the rest of your life with your family and friends, be they dead or alive, experience all of the amazing sights and sounds of the world, the beauty that man has created and the splendor of the natural world, all from the comfort of your computer chair while never experiencing any pain, and any pain that you might even experience in your physical body potentially being mitigated by this. What would you say? Surely many of us would deny this temptation, for as John Stuart Mill posits in his treatise on utilitarianism, simple pleasure is not enough for humankind, being a thinking animal, stating few human creatures would consent to being changed into any of the lower animals for a promise of the fullest allowance of a beast's pleasures. But even Mill recognizes that some of us will. Mill was writing well over 100 years ago. How rare will this be in 25 years when the singularity occurs, when machines catch up to humans intellectually? I have reason to believe that as time goes on, as we become more and more used to this virtual reality, fewer and fewer people will be able to talk themselves out of such a deal with the devil. For while it sounds amazing in theory, if the current state of social media silencing isn't enough of an indication for you, then I don't know what is, but yeah, you probably shouldn't put your life in the hands of any major tech corporations that tend to delete us anyone with an unapproved of opinion. But consider how appealing this might be to us also as we age with these technologies, as we become physically weak. We wish to undo mistakes we made in our lives, or to do all the things we were never able to do, and consider how future post-digital age generations might feel as we stream forward past this singularity, as machines become incredibly more and more advanced. Technology always moves forward and very rarely ever back. So barring massive social collapse, VR is coming. And given that it seems unstoppable, would you take the deal? If you said no, I gotta tell you, you're all a bunch of big brain beauties. And I know that you are because you're listening to a social reject talk about chickens and virtual reality for this long. But because you're a bunch of big brain people, you might be a little bit more concerned with the long-term outcomes of what would happen if you hooked yourself up to a machine, being fundamentally different from a chicken as a human.
Whoa! It's like I'm standing outside on a dark, starless night.
Yeah, I haven't turned them on yet.
As we usually don't define free-range chickens as wasting their life away wandering around the farm, but sitting around in a VR headset all day as a human, that's wasting your life. Or at least that's how we think of it, a lot of us. But even though in this virtual world you can fulfill all of your deepest, darkest desires, you can't fulfill one of your most basic evolutionary drives, at least not yet, and that is the need for reproduction. Many of you might also be thinking about the long-term impacts of large swaths of the population becoming addicted or using this type of technology all the time, and what this kind of usage might mean for the human species and our societies at large. And that's where I become a little bit more long-term concerned. And I'm concerned because we are seeing a decline in first world IQ. Now I must begin, as always, by stating IQ is not a measure of intelligence. It is a measure of a variable called G, which is related to many other variables, including problem solving and future planning, assessing risks, and leading a healthy lifestyle. Now hang on, you Oasis, because I know what or who you think is behind decreasing IQ scores in first world countries.
And they don't stop coming, and they don't stop coming, and they don't stop coming, and they don't stop coming.
But it might be a little bit more complicated than you think. It looks like there's a decline in IQ in advanced Western nations present across all different types of households. As Bratsberg and Rogelberg 2018 found in a study of Norwegian participants that IQ was falling within families, meaning the influence of migrants from generally lower IQ populations, or what we could colloquially call the idiocracy effect of less intelligent people having more children.
It's not something you want to rush into, obviously.
No way.
Oh shit, I'm pregnant again!
I got too many damn kids!
Were not the sole cause for the trend that we're seeing in decreasing Western IQ scores, because they were happening within families. While the Flynn effect saw a major growth in raw IQ scores during the 20th century, a finding many have claimed proves the overwhelming impact of environment on IQ over genetics, but if environment can affect IQ in one direction, can it not then affect it in the other? As this study found the opposite of the Flynn effect, indicating that these advancing societies are now decreasing in their overall IQ scores even when you account for immigration and lower IQ reproduction rates. While there are all kinds of other potential factors at play here that could be accounted for, the fact that we've seen this decline coincide with the rise of the digital age may indicate to some degree that long-term technology reliance may result in some kind of cognitive stagnation, which would explain these Norwegian changes in population data. But I also have some good reasons for thinking that, as we could look at a case study to get a better idea of the potential causal implications of constantly stimulating our brain's pleasure centers, from Portnoy et al. 1986, who examined a 48-year-old woman suffering from chronic pain syndrome, who had proven resistant to conventional pain treatments and was implanted with electrodes in her ventralis posterolaterales. She had in the past begged her family to take the device away from her that gave her this stimulating shock, noting that she would stimulate so frequently she began to neglect relationships, her physical hygiene, and even developed an ulcer on her pleasure finger.
Hey, phrasing!
Only to continually relapse into its use. They assessed her during periods where she was allowed to use the device or when it was taken away. And what they found might have some implications for those Norwegian findings, as she presented with an 11-point IQ deficit from a persistent score of 99 in multiple pre-tests before the implementation of the electrode. When she began using the stimulator regularly, her total IQ decreased to 83. That's a full standard deviation decrease from her initial IQ before implantation. She reported feeling compelled to stimulate repeatedly, despite also noting it made her physically uncomfortable. It made her sexually aroused, generally more anxious, but it didn't make her feel good. She describes it as pleasurable discomfort. A similar kind of experience was reported in an infamous and quite unethical experiment from Dr. Robert Heath, who shoved electrodes into an area of the brain associated with pleasure, the nucleus accumbens, of a chronically depressed man identified as B19, and reported that he immediately began to associate the stimulus with sexual arousal, but not load-blowing. He became incessantly addicted to the electrical pulse when he was allowed to self-stimulate, pleading with the researchers to give it back despite the fact that the shocks were only making him horny. He wasn't jacking the beanstalk, he was just mashing a boner button.
Phrasing.
He was irrationally addicted to an anticipation of pleasure without actually receiving any pleasurable reward.
I wanted the guys who were going to implant a cool drug right into the pleasure center of my brain to think that I had cancer.
You faked cancer to get high?
Not cool, man. Not cool.
Further, Wyville and Berridge 2000 were actually able to identify and induce irrational wanting in rewards for rats. These rats have been trained using Pavlovian cues to expect some sugary goodness after completing a task, and the researchers injected some of them with amphetamine. Science, putting animals on speed because why not?
Why would you do that? Because I can.
Well, actually, it's because amphetamine increases dopamine production, which is often called the pleasure hormone. But the work of Wyville and Berridge indicates that dopamine may in fact not be a pleasure hormone, but really a wanting hormone. Rats given some whiz worked harder and harder to receive a reward based on a mere Pavlovian cue, but they didn't actually receive that smack of sugar. Instead, they were given saline. When they were dopamine high, they wanted more and struggled more and more in response to a mere cue that they thought might result in a reward, regardless of ever actually being rewarded. Given that humans and animals, including apes and mice, have generally similar responses to pain and pleasure in the nucleus accumbens, let's take a final few looks at humans again and what this means for us. This same mechanism I just described in rats could help explain substance addiction in humans, as we might expect. Similarly to the rat experiment, Volkel and Fowler 2000 looked at cocaine addicts. I mean, for research, not just because coke-fueled leaning should be an Olympic sport. I mean, look at these athletes. Anyway, they took a few cokeheads who, given their abuse of the drug, tended to have atrophied dopamine systems, meaning that any positive pleasure of dopamine that they were getting from the use of cocaine had killed it off. They gave some of the cokeheads nothing, and some of them something called methylphenidate.
I know we've talked a lot about how you should never do drugs, but from now on you'll be taking drugs.
And found that an area of the brain not associated directly with pleasure, but rather one associated with repetitive behavior, the orbital frontal cortex, lit up like a Christmas tree. This is because addiction in many ways is reaction to cues. Much like rats, at some point we continue to crave merely based on compulsion, having some idea that maybe we might get a reward, long after the actual reward is gone. This is why people continue to abuse drugs and alcohol long after all of the pleasure they ever received from its usage has died. Even though these addicts no longer receive the dopamine hits they once got, they continue to want. And when we talk about a virtual human pleasure machine, I have the same fear of atrophy, that we will all not become similarly addicted, not to the machine, but to the addiction itself, to these behaviors of repetition, even though they no longer provide any positive feelings, because our brains have been so flooded by constant dopamine. Much as with any addicts, the more and more dopamine you try to squeeze out of your skull actually reduces the size of the organ. It atrophies. Thus, it's not pleasure that consumes us mind and body, it seems. Because mere pleasure alone is not happiness. Pleasure given constantly quickly becomes abused, till you end up like the woman with the electrodes in her head, spamming a button over and over, anticipating a reward, not receiving it, yet still anticipating and continuing to want. A virtual reality pleasure paradise with all of our needs met, with constant dopamine, will shrivel the brain. It's not necessarily a paradise of happiness and pleasure, but rather one of perpetual, unending desire. And with that in mind, let's come to some conclusions about both animal VR and human VR. Getting back to what this means just for humans. I recently spoke about how automation reduces the need for low-skill labor, encouraging a higher IQ society. A paradox seemingly forms here, as this same technological push forward drives us toward a need for higher IQ people. But our collective IQ is dropping, as many people, perhaps mostly those who cannot compete with the large lobes, are in response more likely to essentially check out and become more reliant on technology, particularly entertainment and pleasure technology. This atrophy in intelligence may actually be related to pleasure stimulation. And that makes sense, right? As if you can push a button and get a jolt of dopamine, or get what you think is a jolt of dopamine. As want consumes the mind, the various factors that IQ is related to, things like critical thinking, making healthy life choices, of having better memory, and possessing increased planning capacity. What use are these skills to a person who no longer needs them because they can just press a button and, again, feel better, or at least think they feel better? And the problem is that over time, as this becomes more and more ubiquitous, it means more and more people having these same effects. Decreased IQ across the populace that could be explained by an environmental impact. Why be skilled at creative problem solving when you don't have to solve any problems? And while this might individually decrease IQ scores, as we saw in that one case study, there's a lot of caveats there, as that was one very specific woman with electrodes in her brain. And given that IQ is mostly genetic, I can't say the huge effect that this will have on people, at least immediately, but I do think that it will mean there will be more and more slightly lower IQ people who are more willing to take those choices that don't involve having to think ahead, which ultimately would produce a cycle of this behavior. And as such, it could be that this chicken matrix, which I think is probably fine for them, is just one of the first steps that we're all taking into the pool of immersing ourselves into a digital paradise that is not a paradise, offering up our souls to want. And whether you want to consider the soul spiritual or just a firing of electrons to whoever is running the server, the implications of a lot of the findings I've discussed today are not very bright, just like the people addicted to pleasurable stimulus. And while it is a frightening idea that our own human matrix might be right around the corner, don't start choking on your red pills just yet, as this is all just a theory right now for the most part. But in a world where chicken VR is actually not unrealistic, we may be there soon ourselves. The fear I hold is that slowly increasing the ways in which we have constant access to immediate hits of pleasure through all forms of digital entertainment, and perhaps most of all, virtual reality giving the strength of its effects and its indistinguishability from real life. The crux of this entire question is much more of a human one than one that relates to livestock, For again, as John Stuart Mill wrote, it is better to be a human being dissatisfied than a pig satisfied. Better to be Socrates dissatisfied than a fool satisfied. But what Mill could not likely have anticipated when writing that in the 19th century is current reality and the effect of virtual reality on current reality perceptions, pleasure, happiness, and ultimately reward systems via dopamine or even electrical stimulation, all without the need for any actual rewarding outcomes. If humans increasingly become addicted to the want of pleasure rather than the pleasure itself, might we not allow ourselves to decrease overall in intelligence to the point where we could no longer, as a species, where many may no longer be unsatisfied with this devil's bargain of VR utopia? Could it be that as we slowly increase in all of our stimuli and as we decrease in our pleasure, and then subsequently leading to an increase in our need for stimuli, in our want, and ultimately leading to cognitive atrophy and capitulation to the same kind of virtual farm we are currently considering for chickens? I'm not sure if that's the future, but it's one that I fear. Well, maybe not for animals, certainly for humans. But what do you think? How do you feel about chicken VR? How do you feel about human VR? How do you feel about human pleasure hormones and all these kinds of other things we talked about today?
How does the image make you feel now? Any different?
There was a lot in here. We went from everything from economic theory, livestock rearing techniques, transhumanism, philosophy, social science, neuropsychology, and chimps playing Minecraft. But ultimately, I have one last question. Would you take the deal? Knowing everything we talked about today. If you enjoy my Spedentry, you can support my work through Patreon, Subscribestar, or Streamlabs, or just by purchasing the merch, all linked below. As always, you people are the ones who allow this kind of insane video to happen, for better or for worse for the world. But for me, it's a good thing, and a sincere and deep thank you to all of you for your vast generosity. If you'd like to hang out with me or hear me talk in real life, I will be attending the International Conference on Men's Issues in August in Chicago, linked below, and Minds IRL in Pittman, New Jersey, also in August, for which you can receive 10% off your ticket price by using the code AIDEN. There are also several books below in Amazon affiliate links, and I'm also going to include, because there's a lot of copies left of the books I posted in my previous video on infidelity that you can enter to win for free. Again, linked in the description. If you want to hear me awkwardly roleplay with a bunch of Europeans in a Pathfinder game wherein the most recent plot point revolved around collecting unicorn cum, then you can find me every Tuesday on Nakalavi's channel, the show which prides itself on someone saying the N-word every single session. But as always, thank you for watching, like, sub, all that jazz, and most importantly, Altana Volt.
If we can figure out how to establish a high bandwidth neural interface, then you're no longer a house cat.